There are moments in history that no one sees coming, moments that arrive disguised as the most ordinary of days, wrapped in the same gray light as every morning before them, carrying no warning, no herald, no trumpet call to announce the shift that is about to crack the world open at its foundation. The morning of the grand autumn auction in the kingdom of Valdris was exactly that kind of moment. The sky above the capital city of Stonehaven was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of rain that never quite arrived, and the streets below were already alive with the noise of preparation. Vendors setting up their stalls along the processional roads, servants carrying bolts of silk and crates of flowers toward the palace gates, guards in their deep crimson uniforms, standing at attention with the particular stiffness of men who understood that today, above all days, the king would be watching. The Grand Autumn Auction was the most important social event in the Valdris calendar, and it had been that way for 200 years, a tradition born of old cruelty dressed in new ceremony, a spectacle that the nobility attended with the same hunger they brought to feasts and executions, because in Valdris, the difference between those things had always been mostly a matter of presentation. Ara Vos did not know, when she woke that morning in the narrow servants' quarters on the lowest floor of the East Wing, that her name was already written on the auction register. She did not know that the head steward had received the order 3 days prior, sealed with the king's personal mark in black wax, listing her designation number and her assigned lot. She did not know any of this because no one had told her, which was not unusual. No one told Alara very much of anything. She had learned, in the 9 years she had lived and worked within the walls of Stonehaven Palace, that the most effective way to survive in a place built on hierarchy and casual violence was to become something the hierarchy did not notice. She had perfected the art of invisibility with the patience and precision of someone who understood that visibility, in Valdris, was often the first step toward destruction. She rose at the 4th bell, as she always did, and dressed in her gray servant's uniform, with the quiet efficiency of long habit. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of braiding her dark hair back from her face, pinning it flat against her skull in the severe style required of palace servants, and she did not look at herself in the small cracked mirror above the wash basin, because there was nothing in the looking that would help her. She was 23 years old, and had been classified Omega at her designation ceremony at 15, a moment she remembered not for its pain, though there had been pain, but for the particular quality of the silence in the room afterward, the way the designating elder had looked at her and then looked away, as though her classification were a thing too minor to warrant sustained attention. She had been Omega, and she had been poor, and she had been alone. And in Valdris, those 3 things together formed a kind of sentence that the law was not always needed to enforce. The palace was already stirring with the particular energy of auction day when she carried her cleaning cart through the marble corridors of the state rooms. She had been assigned the East Ballroom and the connecting antechambers, which meant she would be working in the rooms adjacent to the auction hall itself, close enough to hear the preparation, the voices of the officials from the Office of Designation reviewing their lists, the sound of the auction platform being tested for structural soundness by the palace engineers. She kept her head down, and her movements small, pushing her cart around the edges of the rooms, applying polish to the already gleaming floors with a methodical attention that required no thought, and left her mind free to do what it always did during the long hours of physical labor, which was to build, in the private architecture of her imagination, a world in which she was somewhere else entirely. She was halfway through polishing the second antechamber when she heard her designation number. She heard it the way you hear your own name called in a crowded room even when you are not expecting it. That particular sharpening of attention that bypasses conscious thought and goes straight to the body. Number 1147. She stopped moving. The voice belonged to Sub-Registrar Henning, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, and the perpetually harried expression of someone who worked for people far more powerful than himself and knew it. And he was reading from his list to one of the auction coordinators, and the words that followed her number were date of birth, classification, current assignment, physical designation status, and then the words that made the cleaning cloth drop from her hand onto the polished floor. Selected by personal order of His Majesty, King Cale Ashvile, Lot 7, the Humiliation Lot. She stood very still for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Around her, the antechamber continued its busy preparation, no one looking at her, no one noticing the small Omega servant standing frozen beside her cleaning cart with her hands empty at her sides. Then she bent down, picked up the cloth, and continued polishing the floor, because what else was there to do? Because stopping, in her experience, never changed what was coming. It only wasted the time you had before it arrived. If you are watching this story for the first time, take a breath, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power and silence, and the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. And if you have been with this channel before, you already know that the quietest characters are almost always the ones carrying the most extraordinary secrets. Like this video, if you believe that the ones the world tries to overlook are often the ones the world most needs. Now let us go back to Alara, standing in that polished room, and let us follow her into the fire. The humiliation lot was not officially called that. Officially, it was designated Lot 7 of the Grand Autumn Auction, the Sovereign's Selection, a category that had been established 80 years ago during the reign of King Aldrich III, who had used the auction not primarily as a mating ritual, but as a political instrument, a way of publicly degrading rivals and enemies by selecting their Omega-classified family members and subjecting them to the ceremonies of the lot, which involved public presentation, public assessment, and public disposal, meaning that the selected individual was brought to the platform, examined and commented upon by the king and his council, and then released, not taken as a mate, not purchased, simply used as a demonstration of the king's absolute power over every person within his domain. The release was in some ways worse than the taking. It communicated something more devastating than desire. It communicated indifference. You were brought before the most powerful being in the kingdom so that he could look at you and decide you were not even worth keeping. Kael Ashvale had used Lot 7 3 times in his 6-year reign. The first time had been to humiliate Lord Cassian Voth, whose Omega-classified younger brother had been selected, presented, and dismissed with a single sentence from the king, something about insufficient bloodline quality, delivered in the flat tone of a man commenting on livestock. The second time had been to send a message to the merchant guild that had been attempting to organize price controls, their chosen representative's Omega-classified daughter, selected and similarly dismissed. The third time had been harder to decode politically, an elderly Omega woman of no apparent connection to anyone powerful, and the court had spent weeks afterward trying to understand the message, until it was generally agreed that sometimes Kael Ashvale chose Lot 7 simply because he could, simply because the power to humiliate without reason was its own kind of demonstration. And now he had chosen Ara Vos, designation number 1147, palace servant, no family, no connections, no political relevance of any kind. The court, when the selection was announced that afternoon through the official channels, was briefly puzzled, and then rapidly bored. There was no message here. There was no political target. There was simply a gray little Omega. Nobody who had presumably caught the king's attention in some minor way, perhaps by existing in the wrong corridor at the wrong time, and who would be brought to the platform, examined, dismissed, and forgotten before the evening's real entertainment began. Several nobles made bets on how long the examination would take. The consensus was less than 2 minutes. Alara was informed of her selection officially at the third afternoon bell by the head steward, who came to find her in the kitchens where she had been reassigned after finishing the antechambers, peeling root vegetables with 2 other servants while the auction preparation continued around them. He told her in a tone of brisk administrative neutrality, as though he were informing her of a schedule change, that she was to report to the preparation chambers at the 7th bell, where she would be dressed and readied for presentation, and that she should eat something before she went because the preparation process sometimes took several hours. He did not ask her how she felt about this. She did not tell him. She nodded once and went back to peeling the vegetables, and the head steward left, and the 2 other servants beside her went very still for a moment, and then resumed their own work without speaking, because there was nothing to say, because in Valdris there was never anything to say about The things that happened to Omegas when the powerful decided to notice them. She finished her shift. She ate, because the head steward had told her to, and because she understood the practical wisdom of the instruction, even if she had no appetite. She went to the preparation chambers at the 7th bell and submitted to the process with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, standing still while the attendants washed and dressed her in the white presentation garments that Lot 7 required, while they unbound her hair and arranged it down her back in the loose style that indicated an Omega in presentation status, while they applied the minimal cosmetics that palace protocol required for auction participants. She looked at herself in the large mirrors of the preparation chamber and thought that she looked like someone else entirely, which was somehow appropriate, because the person standing in those mirrors in white silk with her dark hair loose around her shoulders was not the person she had spent 9 years learning to be. That person was invisible. This person, unfortunately, was going to be seen. The other auction participants were in various stages of preparation around her. Omegas from across the city and the surrounding territories, who had been selected for the various lots of the Grand Autumn Auction, most of them for the legitimate pairing lots, selected to be evaluated as potential mates for the alphas who had entered the bidding process. Some of them were nervous. Some of them were excited, because for an Omega of low status, being selected by a powerful alpha at the Grand Autumn Auction could represent a genuine improvement in material circumstances, and Valdris had not yet entirely killed the hope that material circumstances could improve. A few of them looked at Alara in her white silk and recognized the significance of the style and cut that indicated Lot 7, and those few looked away quickly, with the particular discomfort of people watching a bad thing happen to someone who cannot stop it. The auction hall of Stonehaven Palace was a room designed to make power visible. Its ceilings were 40 feet high and painted with the history of the Ashvale dynasty in vivid gold and crimson. Every king and his conquered territories rendered in the sweeping strokes of court painters who understood their commission. The floor was black marble, threaded with veins of silver that caught the light of 1,000 candles and threw it back, fractured and multiplied. The platform at the center of the room was raised 3 feet above the floor level, circular, lit from above by a chandelier of such extravagant scale that it had its own maintenance staff. The seating for the nobility curved around this platform in tiered semicircles, so that every seated person had a direct sightline to the person standing at the platform's center, and there was no position on that platform from which you could not be seen by everyone in the room simultaneously. It had been designed that way deliberately. The architecture of the auction hall was the architecture of exposure. Alara stood in the staging corridor with the other Lot 7 participants, of whom there were 4 this year, and listened to the noise of the crowd assembling in the hall beyond the curtained entrance. The sound was enormous, hundreds of voices layered over the music of the court orchestra, the percussion of heels on marble, the occasional sharp laughter that carried above the general noise with the particular quality of laughter that belongs to people who are comfortable in rooms like this. She pressed her back against the corridor wall and concentrated on breathing, on the simple mechanical rhythm of inhale and exhale, on keeping her hands still at her sides. She did not allow herself to think about what was coming, because thinking about it would not change it. And she had learned long ago that anticipatory suffering was a luxury she could not afford. She would endure what she was going to endure. She would do it quietly. She would survive it, because she had survived everything else. And then she would go back to her narrow room and her cleaning cart and her private internal world. And the king and his court would forget her name within a week. She believed this, standing in that corridor. She believed it with the practiced conviction of someone who had built her entire survival strategy on the reliability of her own insignificance. She believed it right up until the moment when the curtain parted and the announcement of Lot 7 began. And she followed the other 3 participants through the curtain and into the blinding light of the chandelier and heard the crowd's attention shift. A physical thing, a pressure change in the room, because the king had arrived. Kyle Ashvale entered the auction hall from the sovereign's entrance on the east side at precisely the 9th bell, as protocol required, and the effect of his entrance on the assembled nobility was the effect it always had, which was to reorganize the room. not because the nobility was particularly afraid of him, though many of them were, and not because they performed deference at his arrival, though they did, but because Cale Ashvale was the kind of physical presence that reorganized space simply by occupying it. He was 31 years old and had been king for 6 years, having taken the throne at 25 after the death of his father under circumstances that the official histories described as natural and that everyone in the court understood to be considerably more complicated than that. He was tall, in the way that alpha-classified individuals of the Ashvale bloodline were tall, which was to say significantly, with the kind of build that spoke of both genetic inheritance and the particular discipline of a man who used his body as a political instrument. His hair was the deep black of the Ashvale line, worn short at the sides and longer at the top, and his eyes were the gray of the Valdres winter sky, and he wore the state ceremonial uniform of the Grand Autumn Auction, with the ease of a man who wore power like a second skin, because he had been wearing it since birth and had never known anything else. He took his position at the sovereign's chair above the main viewing tier and looked down at the platform with the expression he always wore at these events, which was the expression of a man enduring a necessary obligation with the minimum expenditure of genuine attention. His counsel flanked him, and his general, Wren Ashwood, stood at his right with the slightly pained look of a soldier who found court ceremonies fundamentally undignified. The head of the designation office, High Registrar Marin Vale, sat at the king's left with her ledger open and her quill ready, because the king's assessments during Lot 7 needed to be officially recorded for the court archive. Another detail of the ceremonies: elaborate cruelty. The first 3 participants of Lot 7 were presented and assessed in the manner that the court had come to expect from Cale Ashvale's administration of the ritual. He looked at each of them, asked the registrar to confirm their designation details, made a brief remark that was simultaneously impersonal and devastating, and dismissed them. A young man of perhaps 18, selected from one of the outer territories. A woman in her 30s, with the bearing of someone who once had status and had lost it. A teenager, barely past the designation age, whose presence on the Lot 7 roster was a cruelty so obvious that even some of the assembled nobility shifted uncomfortably in their seats, though none of them spoke. Kyle disposed of all 3 in under 6 minutes total. The crowd's attention during this portion of the proceedings had the quality of attention paid to an opening act, engaged but not genuinely invested, waiting for something more interesting. Then, the announcer called Lot 7, Participant 4, designation number 1147, Ara Vos, and Ara walked to the center of the platform. She walked the way she did everything, quietly and precisely, without performance, because she had no performance to give and no energy to waste on one. She reached the center of the circular stage and stopped, and stood with her hands at her sides and her spine straight and her eyes forward, looking at a point approximately 6 inches above the level of the crowd's heads. The technique she had developed over years of standing still while people assessed her and found her wanting. The technique of presence without engagement, of being seen without being vulnerable to the seeing. She was aware of the crowd around her in the diffuse way that you are aware of weather, as a condition of the environment rather than a collection of individuals. She did not look at the king. For a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt considerably longer. Nothing happened. Then Cale Ashvale leaned forward in his sovereign's chair. It was a small movement, a barely perceptible shift of weight, but it was the first time in 6 years of Grand Autumn auctions that anyone in the court had seen the king lean forward during a Lot 7 presentation. And the people who noticed it with the sharp attention of courtiers trained to read the sovereign's body language as a survival skill, and the people who noticed it nudged the people next to them. And within 30 seconds, the entire hall had shifted from the comfortable inattention of an audience waiting for the good part to the electric alertness of an audience that suddenly suspects the good part has already arrived. Cale was looking at Ara Vos. He was looking at her with the gray winter eyes that had dismissed 3 people in the past 10 minutes, without a flicker of genuine interest, and those eyes were now doing something that High Registrar Vale, who had served 3 Ashvale kings and attended 47 Grand Autumn auctions, had never seen them do during a Lot 7 presentation. They were looking, actually looking, The way you look at something that refuses to resolve itself into something familiar, something that your pattern recognition cannot quickly categorize and dismiss. He had chosen her, he remembered, because of a morning 3 weeks ago when he had taken an unscheduled route through the East Wing and seen a palace servant on her knees polishing the baseboards of the corridor with a precision and focus so complete that she had not heard him approach, which was unusual, because alphas of his designation produced a particular physiological effect in most omegas, a subtle biological awareness, and the fact that this one had not flinched or scrambled to her feet, or performed the nervous deference that palace servants typically offered when they realized the king was present, had caught his attention with the sharpness of a thing that doesn't fit. He had looked at her for a moment, and she had continued polishing the baseboard, and when she had finally turned and seen him standing there, she had simply looked at him, a direct, unperformed, entirely unfrightened look, before lowering her eyes in the formal deference of her station. It had lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He had thought about it for 3 weeks. He had chosen her for Lot 7 because he had told himself he wanted to see if the quality he had observed in that corridor was real or accidental, if a woman who could look at the Alpha King without fear would maintain that composure on the platform. He had told himself it was curiosity, the intellectual variety, the kind that had no heat in it. He was not certain, standing at his sovereign's chair looking down at her, that this characterization had been entirely accurate. "Registrar," he said, and his voice was the voice he used in formal proceedings, measured and devoid of inflection. "Confirm the designation details." Marin. File read from her ledger. Name: Ara Vos. Age: 23. Classification: Omega. Standard designation. Bloodline status: unregistered, no surviving family, no house affiliation. Current assignment: Palace Service, East Wing, General Maintenance. Designation: Health status: normal. No distinguishing marks or bloodline indicators on record. The last part of that recitation was standard language, the formal confirmation that the individual being presented carried no special bloodline, designation that would affect the proceedings. In Valdris, certain bloodlines carried legal protections that even the sovereign's lot could not override. Ancient primordial lineages and guardian bloodlines that had been negotiated into the kingdom's founding charter, and that no Ashvale king had successfully stripped from the law, though several had tried. The no distinguishing marks language was a legal clearance, a formality, a box to check. It was at this point that Cale Ashvale descended from the sovereign's chair. This had never happened before. The king did not descend to the platform during Lot 7. The distance was the point. The elevation was the message. The entire geometry of the ceremony depended on the king remaining above, looking down, the physical architecture of the room reinforcing the hierarchy it was designed to celebrate. When Cale stood up and walked down the steps from the viewing tier toward the auction platform, the silence that fell over the hall was so complete that the sound of his footsteps on the marble was audible to everyone in the room. A slow and deliberate percussion that no one in attendance could explain or predict. Alara heard his footsteps. She heard them the way you hear a change in atmospheric pressure, with your whole body rather than just your ears. And she felt the crowd silence the way you feel, a held breath, and she kept her eyes forward, and her hands still, and her spine straight, because what else was there to do? Because the thing about having built your survival on stillness is that it doesn't abandon you just because the circumstances become extraordinary. Because the stillness is not a performance. It is what you are. It is the thing that lives at the center of you, after everything removable has been removed. He stepped onto the platform. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a dark room, as heat and light and the fundamental alteration of the air around you. Up close, the Alpha King was something the court portraits and the official ceremonies did not entirely convey, which was that his presence was a physical phenomenon as much as a social one, that the Alpha designation in the Ashvale line was not merely a political category, but a biological reality, and that standing within arm's reach of him was an experience that operated below the level of conscious thought. She felt it. She kept her eyes forward, and felt it, and breathed through it, with the concentrated steadiness of a woman who had spent 9 years learning to feel things without allowing them to move her. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. "Look at me," he said. It was not a request. It was not the formal command structure of the auction ceremony. It was something else, something that bypassed the official register and operated in the frequency of a direct address between two people. And Ara Vos, who had spent 9 years perfecting the art of not being seen, turned her eyes from the point above the crowd's heads and looked at the Alpha King of Valdris. The silence in the room became something with weight and texture. He was looking at her with those gray winter eyes, and she was looking at him with her dark ones. And something was happening in the air between them that the assembled court could feel without being able to name: a charge, a vibration, the particular quality of a moment that knows it is being historical before anyone in it can confirm that it is. High Registrar Val, who had her quill poised above her ledger to record the king's assessment, found that she could not look away from the platform. General Wren Ashwood, who had attended this auction 6 times and had spent the preceding hour thinking about his dinner, was leaning forward in his chair with an expression of arrested attention. Even the musicians, technically still playing, had softened their instruments to something barely above silence, the musical equivalent of holding their breath. Kale Ashvile reached out and took Ara Vos's hand. This was also not protocol. The sovereign's assessment in Lot 7 was visual and verbal. There was no physical contact prescribed, no ceremonial touching, no ritual that required the king to take the hand of a Lot 7 participant. His fingertips closed around her wrist with a firmness that was not aggressive, but was absolutely certain. The grip of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it. And the skin contact happened. And then the mark happened. The burning started at the point of contact, at the circling of his fingers around her wrist, and it spread up her forearm with a speed and intensity that took the breath out of the room a second time, because everyone on the platform and in the front rows could see it. The mark was silver white, a color that had no business existing in natural light, a luminescence that pulsed rather than shone, spreading up Alara's forearm in a pattern that was unmistakable to every person in that room who had ever opened a history book, because the pattern had been reproduced in those history books as a historical curiosity, a symbol from the founding era of the Valdris kingdom, the mark of a true companion to the royal bloodline, the primordial mate mark, a designation so ancient and so rare that the last recorded instance of its appearance had been exactly 512 years ago. Alara made no sound. She looked down at the burning mark spreading across her arm, and then she looked up at the king's face, and the expression on her face was not fear, and it was not wonder, and it was not triumph. It was the expression of someone who has just received information that they do not yet know what to do with. The careful, measuring look of a mind, trying to process something that exceeds the current categories available to it. Kale was looking at the mark on her arm, and his face had done something that faces with as much practice at controlled expression as his face had were not supposed to do. It had gone unguarded. Just for a moment, just for the span of a breath, the Alpha King of Valdris looked at the silver light burning up the arm of the gray little Omega nobody whom he had selected for humiliation. And he looked like a man who has just had the ground shift beneath his feet and is still deciding whether to reach for something to hold on to or to simply let the shift happen. If you are still watching, and I know you are, then you felt that moment too. You felt the way the world just changed on that platform, the way a single mark on a girl's skin just rearranged everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what you were thinking when that mark appeared, because I want to know if you saw it coming, and I want to know if it felt as inevitable as it feels to me, because sometimes the most world-changing things are the ones that feel like they were always going to happen, like the world was just waiting for the right 2 people to be standing in the right place at the right time. The hall erupted. Not all at once, not in the clean way of a single reaction, but in the chaotic, layered way of 400 people simultaneously trying to process something that their existing frameworks could not accommodate. Voices rising and falling in waves, the specific register of aristocratic composure breaking down under the pressure of genuine shock. Because genuine shock is the great equalizer. It reduces dukes and servants to the same raw state of undone. And what was happening on that platform was generating genuine shock in quantities sufficient to undo everyone present. Marin Val was on her feet. Her ledger was open to the wrong page, and her quill was dripping ink onto the marble floor, and she was not noticing either of these things, which told you everything you needed to know about the magnitude of the moment. Because Marin Val had been head of the designation office for 22 years, and had never in that time dropped ink on anything. That was not paper. She was looking at the mark on Ilara's arm with the expression of a woman whose entire professional life had been built on the premise that certain things did not happen anymore, that the ancient designations were historical artifacts, that the world was governed by the systems she administered, and not by older, stranger forces that operated on their own timelines. General Ashwood had his hand on his sword, not drawing it, not threatening anything, simply the instinctive response of a man trained to respond to the unknown with readiness, a reflex that he controlled immediately, but could not entirely suppress. The council members were talking over each other in urgent murmurs, and somewhere in the upper tiers, a noble woman had fainted, and her companions were making the particular kind of noise that surrounds fainting in formal settings, concern and irritation in equal measure. Cale Ashvale was still standing on the platform, still holding Ara Vos's wrist, still looking at the mark, and he was the still center of the erupting room, not because he had achieved stillness, but because he had not yet moved, had not yet processed the fact of what was on her skin into any kind of response, was in that suspended moment that precedes action, when the mind is still taking inventory of the catastrophe. Because this was, from a certain perspective, a catastrophe. The primordial mate mark was not a symbolic designation. It was not a religious concept or a mythological metaphor. In the founding law of Valdris, written into the kingdom's constitutional charter 500 years ago during the reign of the first Ashvale king, the primordial mate mark had a specific legal status. The bearer of the mark was designated the true companion of the bloodline, a status that superseded all other social designations, including the Omega classification, including servant status, including every category by which Ara Vos had lived her life. The bearer of the primordial mark could not be harmed, could not be dismissed, could not be overridden by any law or decree written after the charter. The mark was older than the law. The mark was, in the legal language of the founding documents, the law's own foundation, and the king, by touching her, had activated it, intentionally or not, by reaching out and taking her wrist on that platform, by making the skin contact that the old law recognized as the sovereign's acknowledgment. He had set in motion a process that 5 centuries of Ashvale rule had not needed to accommodate because it had not happened, and that now, because he had let 3 weeks of inexplicable curiosity override 6 years of political calculation, was happening with all the deliberate momentum of something that had been waiting a very long time for its moment. Ilara became aware, as the noise of the hall continued around her, of several things in rapid succession. She became aware that the burning on her arm had settled into a warmth that was not unpleasant, that the silver light had resolved into a mark of extraordinary intricacy, a pattern of interlocking symbols that she recognized dimly from the illuminated history manuscripts. She had sometimes been assigned to dust in the palace library, a pattern that the librarian had once mentioned to her in passing as the oldest recorded symbol in Valdris's written history. She became aware that the king had not released her wrist. She became aware that the crowd's noise was reshaping itself, that the initial eruption was settling into something more structured, that voices were separating from the chaos with specific content, and that some of those voices were saying things like impossible, and others were saying things like the founding charter, and others, the ones that chilled her most, were saying things like, "What does this mean for the succession?" She looked at the king's face. He was looking back at her now, the unguarded moment over, the practiced control back in place, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could not read, that contained too many things simultaneously, something that might have been recognition, and something that might have been resistance to that recognition, and something beneath both of those that was rawer and less nameable. "What is your name?" he said, and his voice was very quiet in the noise of the hall. quiet enough that it seemed to exist in a private space between the two of them, separate from the surrounding chaos. "Ilara," she said, and her voice was quiet too, steadier than she would have predicted, the steadiness of someone who has been living in the aftermath of impossible things for long enough that the experience of impossible things no longer entirely disrupts them. "Ara Vos," he said, confirming it from the registrar's earlier recitation. "Yes." He looked at the mark on her arm for another moment, and she watched something move through his expression, some internal calculation or reckoning that she was not party to. Then he looked up at his council, at Vale, at Ashwood, at the erupting hall full of people who were going to spend the next several months making this moment into a story that served their own interests, and he made a decision. She could see it happen, could see the moment the calculation resolved into something actionable. "Clear the platform," he said, to the room, not to her. But the words were not a dismissal, and his hand was still around. Her wrist, and the mark was still burning silver on her skin, and nothing about the next few hours Ilara understood was going to resemble any version of the evening she had prepared herself for. The hours that followed the auction platform were the most disorienting of Ilara's life, and her life had not been short on disorientation. She was taken, still in her white presentation silk, from the platform through a side entrance by a guard detail she had never interacted with, the king's personal household guard rather than the general palace security. Men with black and silver uniforms who moved with the specific efficiency of people trained for situations where the usual protocols had dissolved. She was taken not to the servants' quarters, and not to any official stateroom, but to a set of chambers in the North Tower that were clearly residential, but equally clearly had not been used recently. The furniture covered in dust cloths that the guards began removing with a brisk purpose that suggested they had been briefed, but not given a great deal of notice. She sat in a chair, uncovered from beneath its dust cloth, and looked at the mark on her arm and thought, because thinking was what she did when she was afraid, and she was afraid now, not the cold, calculated fear of the auction platform, which had been fear of known things, of a known cruelty in a known form, but the larger, more amorphous fear of unknown things, of the shape of a future that had just been rewritten in silver, light on her skin without her consent or preparation. She was there for perhaps an hour before anyone of substance came to speak to her. The first to arrive was not the king, but Marin Vielle, the high registrar, who entered with her ledger clutched to her chest, and her expression the carefully neutral professional face of a woman who had decided that the best way to interact with an unprecedented situation was to treat it as a bureaucratic problem requiring procedural resolution. She sat across from Ilara and opened her ledger to a fresh page and explained, in the measured tones of someone reciting a document they have memorized because the content is too complicated to improvise, what the primordial mate mark meant in terms of legal status. Ilara listened. She was good at listening. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both procedural, and Vielle answered them with something that looked like professional respect in someone whose professional respect was not easily earned. When Vielle finished her recitation and closed her ledger, she looked at Ilara across the small table between them, and for a moment, the professional mask was entirely gone, and what looked out from behind it was something very human, a woman in her 50s who had spent her whole career administering the systems of a kingdom that had not always been kind to the people it administered. Looking at a young woman who had just been inserted by ancient law into the center of everything, and feeling the particular weight of that insertion. "The charter is very clear," Vielle said. "It does not require the king's consent. The mark's appearance is the designation. He cannot undo it by declaration. Can he undo it by any other means?" Ilara asked. The pause before Vielle's answer was very small and very significant. "That is a question," she said carefully, "that several of my colleagues have already begun researching." Ilara understood this to mean yes, they were looking for a way, and she filed it, under the growing list of things she would need to think about when she had more time and privacy to think. And she thanked Vielle with the courtesy she brought to everyone regardless of their station. And Vielle left, and Ilara was alone again with the mark on her arm and the sound of the North Tower settling into the cold of the Valdres autumn night. Kyle came at midnight. She heard his footsteps. Recognized them the way you recognize the sound of something coming that you have been anticipating, without acknowledging that you were anticipating it. The same rhythm she had heard on the auction platform descending toward her. Unhurried and deliberate. He came without the guard detail, without Vale or Ashwood or any of the people who usually formed the institutional cushioning around the king's personal movements. And when he opened the door to the North Tower chambers, he was wearing a simpler version of the state uniform, without the ceremonial elements, the version that was still clearly the clothing of a powerful man, but was less theatrical about it. And he looked, if she were honest, like someone who had spent several hours in difficult conversation with people who had wanted things from him that he had not wanted to give. He looked at her sitting in the uncovered chair, and she looked at him standing in the doorway. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the situation between them was so far outside the territory of their respective experience, and the scripts those experiences had generated that the usual frameworks for initiating conversation were simply not available. "You could have caused a panic," he said, and it was not the opening she had expected, which meant it was probably the opening he had landed on after discarding several others. On the platform, when the mark appeared. Another person would have. Panicking wouldn't have changed the mark, she said. Something moved in his expression. "No," he said. "It wouldn't have." He came into the room and stood by the window that looked out over the darkened palace gardens, his back partially to her, and she watched him and waited, because waiting was something she understood better than most people. "The council wants the founding charter reviewed," he said. "They believe there may be provisions for dissolution in cases where the designation is contested." "Vile told me they were looking," Alara said. "What Vile may not have told you," he said, turning from the window, "is that in 500 years of charter scholarship, no one has found a dissolution provision, because the charter doesn't include one. It predates the concept of contest. It was written by people who considered the mark's appearance to be the only verification required." She looked at him. "You've already looked," she said. "I had 6 years of legal counsel briefed within an hour of leaving the platform," he said. "Yes, I've already looked." This was information. This was the king telling her, deliberately, that he had looked for a way out and had not found one, which meant he was telling her that he was not going to pretend there was a way out when there wasn't, which meant he was choosing to engage with the reality of the situation rather than the preferred fiction of the situation, which was a more honest response than she had prepared herself for. "What does the charter require?" she asked, and her voice was steady. He looked at her for a long moment. The gray winter eyes were doing the thing. Again, the thing where they were actually looking. The thing that had started on the auction platform and had not resolved into anything manageable since. "Acknowledgment," he said. "The mark requires formal acknowledgment by the bloodline bearer, which I have given, on the platform, by contact. The next step, according to the charter, is integration. The bearer of the mark is to be integrated into the household of the bloodline within 30 days of the acknowledgement. Integration," she repeated. "It is a word that covers considerable ground," he said, and the dry precision of the delivery was not humor exactly, but it was adjacent to it, and it was so unexpected in the context of everything that had happened that it landed strangely, a small vent in the pressure of the situation. And Alara found herself looking at him with a slightly different quality of attention. "I am not asking you to do anything tonight," he said then, and the tone had shifted, the dryness gone, replaced by something more careful. "The situation is what it is. The charter is what it is. What happens next requires decisions that neither of us should make tonight." He paused. "Are you comfortable in these chambers?" It was such a small question in the middle of such an enormous situation that it took her a moment to register it as genuine. "They'll do," she said. "I'll have the household staff assigned in the morning," he said. "If you need anything before then, the guard outside will assist." He moved toward the door, and she watched him. And when he reached it, he stopped with his hand on the frame and did not quite turn back. "The corridor," he said. "3 weeks ago. You didn't flinch." She waited. "I selected you for Lot 7 because of that," he said. I should tell you that. I know, she said. He did turn then, and the look on his face when she said those two words was complex and unresolved. The look of a man who had expected to continue controlling a narrative and had just discovered that the other party to the narrative had their own understanding of it. You knew why I selected you, he said. I heard the sub-registrar reading from the list, she said. Before the official announcement, I had time to think about why. The silence between them was different from the silence on the platform. That silence had been the silence of a world holding its breath before a change. This silence was smaller and more interior. The silence of two people discovering that their respective assumptions about the interaction they were having may have been operating on incomplete information. Good night, Ara Vos, he said. Good night, Your Majesty, she said. He left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the North Tower corridor. And then she sat alone in the uncovered chair, in the unfamiliar room with the silver mark on her arm and the palace night pressing against the windows. And she thought, with the careful, systematic quality she brought to every significant problem, about the shape of the territory she had just been moved into. The days following the Grand Autumn Auction were the most complex diplomatic period Stonehaven had experienced in a decade, and the complexity was almost entirely generated by a woman who said very little and moved very quietly through spaces that were still, technically, too small for what she had become. The court's response to the primordial mate mark arranged itself, over the first week, into 3 distinct factions. The first faction, which included most of the older nobility and the constitutional scholars, processed the mark as a legal event requiring procedural response, and occupied itself primarily with the intensive review of the founding charter and its supplementary documents that the king had requested. A review that, as Cale had told her, produced no dissolution provisions and left the constitutional scholars in the uncomfortable position of having to tell the most powerful man in Valdris that there was nothing they could do. The second faction was the political opportunists, the nobles and council members who understood that the emergence of an ancient designee in the modern court represented a redistribution of at least symbolic power, and who began almost immediately calculating how to position themselves relative to this redistribution. Some of them decided that their interests lay in supporting the mark's legitimacy, because a true companion to the Ashvale bloodline was a thing of enormous traditional authority, and authority traditionally benefited those adjacent to it. Others decided their interests lay in undermining it, for the inverse reason. The court began to reorganize itself around these positions, with the fluid political urgency of an ecosystem responding to a new variable. The third faction was smaller and less formally organized, but it was perhaps the most significant, and Alara became aware of it gradually through the quality of attention she received from people who were not part of the established court structure, from the serving staff who brought her meals to the North Tower, from the junior officials she encountered in the corridors, from the stable hands and the kitchen workers and the clerks and the guards who had grown up in Valdris under the same classification system that had defined her life, and who were watching what had happened to designation number 1147 with a quality of attention that was not political calculation, but something older and more personal. They were watching to see what it meant. They were watching to see if an Omega woman with no house, no family, and no status could exist in the North Tower of Stonehaven Palace without being destroyed by the forces that the palace represented. They were watching because the answer mattered to them in a way that it did not matter to the constitutional scholars and the political opportunists, because the answer was about whether the world they lived in was the only possible version of itself. Alara was aware of all 3 factions and was not immediately certain what to do about any of them. What she was certain of was that doing nothing was not a viable strategy, that the invisibility she had cultivated for 9 years was no longer available to her, that the mark on her arm had made her visible in a way that could not be undone, and that the only question was whether the visibility would be used for something or simply endured. She had endured a great many things. She had found, in the process of enduring them, that endurance and passivity were not the same thing, that you could survive in a hostile system and still maintain the interior architecture of a self that the system did not own. But she had also found the limits of that strategy. She had found them on the auction platform, standing under the chandelier with the crowd's attention pressing against her like a physical weight. And she had found them in the king's face when he had turned at the door and said the corridor 3 weeks ago, in the voice of a man who had been thinking about something for longer than he intended. She decided, on the 5th day after the auction, to visit the palace library. This required navigating a portion of the palace she had previously only accessed as a cleaning staff member, and it required doing so in the changed capacity that the mark represented, and it required, therefore, making the changed capacity legible in some way, because she could not walk into the library as a servant without the library staff treating her as a servant, and she could not walk in without a clear capacity at all, because in a building this full of people who needed to understand who they were interacting with before they knew how to interact, ambiguity was its own kind of vulnerability. She thought about this carefully, and then she put on the simplest of the garments that had been brought to the North Tower chambers, not the white presentation silk and not the elaborate formal wear that someone in the palace household had decided she should have access to, but a dark wool dress of good quality that was formal enough to be unambiguous without being theatrical. And she walked to the library in the mid-morning with the same quiet precision she had always moved with, except that she did not keep her head down. The library staff received her with the specific quality of discomfort that accompanies the sudden social reclassification of someone previously known in a different capacity. The head librarian, a man named Oswin, who had worked in the palace library for 30 years, and who had presumably on at least a few of those years asked the cleaning staff to be careful around the illuminated manuscripts, looked at Alara standing in the entrance of his library in her dark wool dress, with the silver mark visible on her forearm where she had pushed the sleeve up, and did an extremely controlled version of the reclassification calculation that the entire palace had been doing for 5 days, and then said, in the tones of a professional whose professionalism was being tested, "How may I assist you?" "I'd like access to the founding charter documents," Alara said. "Not the copies the scholars have been working from. The originals." Oswin looked at her for a moment. "The originals are restricted," he said. "I know," she said. "I would like to request access." He made her wait while he consulted with the senior archivist, which was fair, and then he made her wait while the senior archivist sent a message to the designation office for confirmation of her status relative to the charter documents, which was also fair, and Alara waited with the patience of someone who had done a great deal of waiting in her life, and understood that it was often less about power and more about information. And eventually Oswin returned and showed her to the archive room where the original charter documents were kept in climate-controlled cases, and left her with cotton gloves and a magnifying glass, and the professional cordiality of a man who had decided to be correct about this, even if he was not yet certain how he felt about it. She spent 3 hours with the original documents. She read them with the concentrated attention she had developed over years of reading anything she could access in the palace, which had not been much, but which had been enough to teach her that the difference between reading for content and reading for understanding was the difference between following a road and understanding the territory the road was built through. The founding charter was dense and archaic and assumed a great deal of contextual knowledge that she did not have, but she worked through it with methodical patience, and by the end of the 3 hours, she had a clearer picture of what the primordial mate designation meant in the original legal context, and what she found was both less manageable and more interesting than what Vale had told her. What Vale had told her was accurate as far as it went. The mark was a legal designation that superseded the Omega classification. The bearer could not be harmed or dismissed. The charter required integration within 30 days. All of this was true. What Vale had not told her, possibly because it was so far outside the operational concerns of the current situation that it had not seemed relevant, was the rest of it. The parts of the founding charter that dealt not with the legal status of the mark's bearer but with the mark's nature, with what the original framers of the charter had understood the primordial mate to be, and why they had given the designation the protections they had. The original charter had been written by people who believed that the Ashvale bloodline carried a specific form of ancient power, a primordial designation that ran deeper than the Alpha classification, older than the designation system that had developed around it over centuries. The founding king, Aldrich I, had been a primordial Alpha, a designation that in the original documents was treated as categorically different from the Alpha designation that had become the kingdom's primary power category, a distinction that had been blurred over 5 centuries of bureaucratic evolution until the modern court understood the Ashvale bloodline primarily in terms of the Alpha classification rather than the primordial one. The primordial mate was not simply the legal companion to the bloodline bearer. She was, according to the founding documents, the stabilizing counterpart to the primordial Alpha's power, the entity whose presence kept the ancient bloodline's more dangerous aspects in check, whose absence created, in the original language, an imbalance that expressed itself in a kingdom's governance as severity without mercy, strength without wisdom, power without purpose. Alara sat in the archive room with the cotton gloves still on her hands and looked at this language for a long time. She thought about a kingdom that had spent 6 years under a king who was, by the court's own private assessment, not cruel without reason, but not restrained by mercy, a man whose political intelligence was without question and whose human connections were a matter of ongoing concern among the council members who had to work with him daily. She thought about the Lot 7 presentations, 3 times in 6 years, each one a demonstration of power unmodified by care. She thought about a man who had walked down from the sovereign's chair, not because the ceremony required it, but because something in him had required it, had pulled him toward a woman who had looked at him without fear, had not been able to leave it alone for 3 weeks, had then stood on a platform in front of his entire court and made the contact that the old law recognized as acknowledgment. She thought, he didn't know what he was doing. He followed something without understanding what it was, and then, following. That thought with the honest rigor she brought to things she would rather not be honest about. Neither did I. She asked Oswin on her way out whether the library had any historical documentation of the previous primordial mate designation, the one 500 years ago. He said the documents were in the archive but had been considered primarily historical curiosities and were not in good condition. She asked if she could return the next day to review them. He said yes, with the careful courtesy he had maintained throughout the visit, and she thanked him with the genuine quality that she brought to genuine things, and walked back to the North Tower with the late afternoon light coming through the palace windows in long amber lines, carrying the weight of the documents she had read and the shape of the thoughts they had generated. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet, because this story is going to take us somewhere I think you need to see. Somewhere that has to do with what it means to build a relationship not from attraction or circumstance, but from the slow and difficult work of becoming legible to each other, of learning to read the maps of 2 people who have both spent their lives making themselves difficult to find. Hit the subscribe button and let us continue. The king requested a formal meeting with her on the 8th day, not an informal midnight conversation, not the ambiguous middle ground territory of whatever the North Tower midnight visit had been, but a formal meeting, announced through the household steward and conducted in one of the smaller council rooms with Marin Vael present as witness and recorder, which was either scrupulous adherence to protocol or the king's way of establishing that the meeting was on the record, or both. Alara went in her dark wool dress and sat across the table from him with Vael at the end, and her hands folded on the table and the silver mark visible, as it always was now, because she had stopped. Covering it. Covering it had felt like the same kind of self-erasure she had been practicing for 9 years, and she had decided, in the archive room with the founding documents, that she was done with self-erasure. The meeting was procedural in its stated purpose. Kale laid out what the integration process would involve in practical terms. She would be assigned permanent chambers in the palace. She would be provided with appropriate household support. Her legal status would be formally amended in the designation office records. She would begin to participate, at a pace to be determined, in the formal functions of the palace that were now legally relevant to her status. He said all of this in the flat administrative register he used for formal proceedings, and Marin Vael took notes, and Alara listened. When he finished the procedural portion, he looked at his notes for a moment, then at Vael, and then at Alara. "Is there anything you want to raise?" he said, and the shift in register was small, but detectable. The difference between a formal query, directed at a situation, and a direct question directed at a person. Yes, she said. Vial's quill paused. The Founding Charter's documentation of the primordial designation, Alara said. The original materials, not the summaries that have been circulating in the legal review. I've been reading them over the past 3 days. The quality of attention in the room changed. Kyle was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his response to discovering that she had information he had not anticipated her having. And, he said, the primordial mate designation in the original documents is not primarily a legal status, she said. It has legal consequences, which are what the review has been focused on. But the charter framers understood it as something more fundamental. The primordial alpha and the primordial companion are described as complementary aspects of a single function. Separately, the documents say each represents an incomplete expression of the bloodline's full capacity. She paused. I thought you should know that, since you're the primordial alpha in this equation, and since no one appears to have read the original documents carefully enough to tell you. The silence in the small council room was very different from the silence of the auction hall. It was the silence of two people in a room where something had just been said that could not be unsaid. Something that had shifted the landscape of the conversation irrevocably. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Vial was not writing. You've been in the archive for 3 days, he said. Yes, she said. Why? He said. And the question was not bureaucratic. Because I needed to understand what had happened to me, she said. And because I thought you probably needed to understand it too. And it seemed unlikely that anyone around you had an incentive to tell you something you might not want to hear. The thing that moved through his expression at this was complicated, and she watched it move without trying to interpret it, because some things require the time to resolve themselves before the interpretation is possible. Are you saying, he said slowly, that the constitutional review has been focused on the wrong part of the document? I'm saying the constitutional review has been focused on the legal implications of a designation that has metaphysical dimensions the law is inadequate to capture, she said. Yes. Another silence. Then, so quiet she almost missed it. Something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of regard. The particular quality of attention a person pays to something that has just exceeded their assessment of its capacity. Vial, he said, without looking away from Alara. We'll need the original archive materials brought to the primary council chamber. Yes, Your Majesty, Vial said, and began writing again. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about Alara's new position was simple, and she would not have trusted it if it were, because she had grown up in a system where simplicity generally meant that the complexity had been moved rather than resolved, that someone with less power than you was bearing it somewhere out of your sight. The North Tower chambers became her permanent residence, and she moved through them with the careful orientation of someone learning a new territory. The particular quality of attention she had, always paid to the physical spaces she inhabited, noticing exits and sightlines and acoustics, the knowledge that had kept her safe in the palace as a servant, and that continued to be useful in the palace as something more complicated. The court watched her. She was aware of the watching, the way you are aware of being observed when the observation is pervasive, not always conscious of specific eyes but continually aware of the condition of visibility, the knowledge that everything she did was being processed and assessed and fed into the various calculations that the court's multiple factions were running. She navigated this awareness with the same practiced calm she brought to everything, not because she was unaffected by it, but because affect was not always the useful response, because there was a difference between feeling a thing and allowing it to determine your actions. The second faction, the political opportunists, began to make themselves known to her through the vehicles available to court politics, invitations to informal gatherings, carefully phrased notes delivered through household staff, requests for audiences that were framed as social calls. Some of these she accepted, and some she declined, not on the basis of the individual's existing political position, but on her assessment of what the interaction would cost and what it might yield. The same calculus she had always applied to interactions in the palace, except that the currency had changed. She was learning, with the methodical patience she brought to learning, the grammar of a power that she had never expected to speak. The third faction she approached differently, the people who were watching from outside the court structure. The serving staff and the clerks and the junior officials and the others whose lives were shaped by the classification system in ways the nobility preferred not to examine. These were the people she had been, and she understood their watching in her body rather than just in her mind, because she knew the specific quality of hope that looks for proof that the world can be otherwise, that watches for a signal that the categories by which everything has been arranged might be more negotiable than they appear. She could not make that proof from her position alone. She understood this clearly, without sentimentality. But she could be legible to them in a way that previous holders of unusual positions had not been. Legible not as a symbol or an exception, but as a person who understood where they stood and what it meant, who had spent 9 years in the same system, and remembered every detail of what that felt like. The formal acknowledgment ceremony required by the founding charter was scheduled for the 20th day after the auction, which was at the close of the 30-day window, and which Alara understood to be a deliberate choice on the king's part, a delay that was not avoidance, but rather the use of the available time to prepare something rather than simply execute a requirement. Vielle confirmed this, in one of the briefings she now attended regularly, with the neutral information delivery that had become her mode of communication with Alara, a neutrality that contained, Alara had noticed, a growing quality of respect that was not entirely professional. His Majesty has requested that the ceremony be conducted according to the original charter provisions, rather than the modified forms that subsequent administrations developed, Vielle said. This is significant because the modified forms had stripped the primordial language from the proceedings. The original provisions name both parties by their charter designations and include the full traditional acknowledgment texts. He read the original documents, Alara said. He has spent approximately 60 hours in the archive over the past 2 weeks, Vielle said. By my count. Alara looked out the north tower window at the Valdris autumn sky, which had gone from pewter to the thin, clear blue of late season, and thought about a king spending 60 hours in an archive reading documents he had spent 6 years not needing to read, and felt something in her chest that she examined with caution, because feeling things about Kael Ashvale was territory that required careful navigation. Not because the things were not real, but because the navigation of real things required the same methodical honesty she applied to everything else. And the honest question she kept returning to was, how much of what she was observing was the man, and how much was the mark's influence on both of them, and whether that distinction was as meaningful as she wanted it to be. She raised this question with him directly, because she had decided, somewhere in the second week, that direct was the register she was going to operate in with him, that the performance of indirection had never served her, and was not going to start serving her now. They were in the council chamber where the original archive. Materials had been laid out for review, and she had been walking him through the sections she had found most significant, and he had been following with the concentrated attention of someone encountering a framework they had not had access to before. And there had been a quality in the work of the past several hours that was less adversarial than anything between them had been before, the particular ease of two people engaged in a common intellectual task. And it was in this context that she said, "I've been thinking about the mark." He looked up from the document he was reading. "Yes," he said. "The original text described the primordial connection as something that develops," she said. "It's not instantaneous. The mark is a recognition, not a completion. The founders appear to have understood that the full nature of what the mark indicates takes time to become actual. I've read those sections," he said. "Then you've read the part about the distinction between the recognition and the bond," she said. "The mark recognizes the potential. The bond requires choice." He was very still across the table. "I want to be clear," she said, "that I am not choosing anything tonight. I am also not choosing. I am observing that we are both operating in a situation where an ancient designation has been activated, and where neither of us fully understands yet what we are choosing or not choosing, and where the honest response to that uncertainty is to name it rather than proceed as though it were resolved." He looked at her for a long time, with the gray eyes that were doing the actual-looking thing, and she looked back with the steadiness she had cultivated for 9 years. and that had become something different in the past 3 weeks. Less the steadiness of self-protection, and more the steadiness of someone who has decided to be fully present to a difficult thing. "You do this," he said. "Do what?" she said. "Say the thing that is true in exactly the number of words required to say it," he said. "Without performance and without deflection. I have been in this court for 31 years, and I have almost never encountered it. I've been in this court for 9 years," she said. "I found that performance was expensive and I couldn't afford it." The thing that moved through his expression was warmer than anything she had seen on his face in the public contexts, and she noted it, and filed it, and did not yet know what to do with it. "Neither could I," he said, quietly, and looked back at the document, in the ways that mattered. She did not respond to this immediately, because it required careful thought, and because she was beginning to understand that with this particular person, careful thought was more valuable than quick response. She let it rest between them. The admission that was more significant than it appeared, coming from a man whose entire public existence was the performance of a power that left no room for the acknowledgment of its own costs. And she turned back to the document she had been reading, and they worked in silence for another hour, with the archive materials spread between them and the Valdres autumn beyond the windows going dark. And there was something in the quality of the silence that was, if she were honest, more intimate than many things that were not silent at all. "Let me ask you something." Because this is the moment in the story where the ground is shifting under both of them, and neither of them is saying what they're actually feeling, and I want to know from you, watching this, what you think the right pace is. Do you think Alara is right to move carefully? Or do you think she's been careful long enough? Tell me in the comments, because this story has a long way to go, and I want to hear your voice in it. The formal acknowledgment ceremony took place on a Thursday morning in the 20th day, in the palace's oldest hall, a room that predated the current structure of Stonehaven by 2 centuries, a room with stone walls and high narrow windows and none of the gilded excess of the staterooms, a room that looked like it had been built by people who understood that certain things required space to breathe rather than space to impress. The nobility of the court was present, because the ceremony required witnesses, but the atmosphere was different from the auction, less theatrical, more weighted. The constitutional scholars were there. The council was there. Marin Vale stood at the front of the room with the founding charter opened to the relevant section, the original document, not a copy. And the room had the particular quality of attention that comes when people are present for something they understand to be historical, regardless of their feelings about it. Alara stood at the front of the room in a dress that Vielle had worked with her to choose, not the elaborate court formal wear that someone in the palace household had assumed she should have, but something drawn from the historical documentation of the founding era's acknowledgement ceremonies. A deep blue that the original documents referenced as the traditional color for the acknowledgement participant, simple in construction, but made of material of extraordinary quality, and the silver mark on her forearm was visible and present and unapologetic. She had chosen, this morning, not to cover it. She had chosen a great many things this morning, and that was the smallest of them. Cale stood across from her, and the formal court uniform he wore was also historically derived, and he looked in this ancient room with its stone and narrow light, less like the political instrument she had spent 9 years watching from the corridors, and more like something older, something that the founding document's language could accommodate better than the modern court's language could, the primordial alpha in the context that the primordial designation had been made for. She was aware of this, and she filed it with the careful attention she gave to things that were true and significant. Vielle read the founding texts in the original Valdres, the old form of the language that predated the modern court register, and the words had a cadence and weight that the modern form of Valdres did not carry, and the room was absolutely silent for them, the kind of silence that is not emptiness, but density, the silence of attention so total it becomes its own sound. The acknowledgement required both of them to speak. Alara had prepared her section with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything in the past 20 days, had translated the original text, and worked with Vielle to ensure her understanding of what she was agreeing to was accurate and complete. and she spoke the words in the modified modern form of Valdris, that Vial had confirmed was legally equivalent to the original, and her voice was steady and clear in the stone room, and she looked at Cale Ashvale when she said them, and did not look away, because she had decided that if she was going to choose this, she was going to choose it with her whole face visible. He spoke his portion in the same clear register, without theatrical emphasis, looking at her with the gray eyes that had been, she thought, doing a great deal of work over the past 20 days, carrying the weight of things being reconsidered. When the acknowledgment was complete, Vial made the formal notation in the charter record, and the witnesses witnessed, and it was done. The court reception that followed was complex and crowded and politically charged in the way that everything in Stonehaven was complex and crowded and politically charged, and Alara moved through it with the practiced navigation of someone who had spent years reading rooms, which was a skill that transferred more efficiently than she might have predicted from the servant's perspective to the whatever she was now perspective, because rooms were rooms, and people were people, and the dynamics of power and attention operated on recognizable principles regardless of your position within them. She spoke with the constitutional scholars who wanted to understand her experience of the archive review. She spoke with the council members who wanted to understand her political intentions. A question she answered honestly, which is to say that she told them she was still in the process of developing political intentions and would inform them when she had some. She spoke with several nobles, whose expressions told her they were still running the calculation of whether she was an asset or a threat, and she gave them no additional information to resolve the calculation with, because they would make their decisions based on their interests regardless of what she said, and she saw no reason to assist them with it. And she spoke with a young woman she had not seen since the auction platform, one of the serving staff who had been assigned to the reception and who caught Alara's eye from across the room with the specific quality of look that contained an entire relationship in a single moment of eye contact. The look of someone who knew you in a prior capacity and was adjusting to a current one. Alara crossed the room to her, which was a thing that the person she had been 3 weeks ago would never have done, not because she would have been unwilling, but because crossing a room to speak to a junior serving staff member at a court reception was the kind of social statement that the court would read and process and factor into its calculations. And she had made a decision. Somewhere in the archive and the council chamber, and the long nights of careful thought, that the calculations the court made were going to have to accommodate her rather than the other way around. The young woman's name was Tessa, and she was 17, and she had been in palace service for 2 years. And she had been in the auction preparation area on the night of the grand autumn auction, and had seen Alara being dressed in the white silk, and the look on her face now had the specific quality of a person seeing proof of something they had needed proof of. "You're okay," Tessa said quietly. And it was not quite a statement, and not quite a question. "Yes," Alara said. "I'm okay." They did not have more time than that, because the reception moved around them with its demands. But it was enough, and Alara carried it with her through the rest of the evening, as a reminder of what it was for. This whole complicated machinery of positions and acknowledgments and political calculations, what the purpose of it was when you got down below the ceremony to the thing that mattered. The shift in Cale Ashvale happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most fundamental shifts happen, and Alara observed it with the careful attention of someone who had decided to be honest about what she was observing, rather than managing it from a safe distance. It happened in the archive, in the council chamber, in the small interactions of daily proximity that the integration process generated, and it happened in the particular way that shifts happen in people who are not accustomed to allowing them, haltingly, and with resistance and with the particular quality of internal conflict that accompanies the revision of a self-image that has been structurally load-bearing. He had built his entire political identity on a certain kind of invulnerability she had come to understand, reading the courts, history and the king's own documented record, with the same attention she had applied to the founding documents. The invulnerability was not incidental to his governance. It was its architecture. He had come to the throne at 25 in circumstances that required him to demonstrate immediately and conclusively that he could not be manipulated through sentiment or attachment, and he had demonstrated this, repeatedly and at cost, and the court had organized itself around the resulting certainty about what the king was and what he was not. And 6 years of this had built something in him that was very stable and very effective, and very much the thing that the founding documents described when they talked about strength without wisdom, power without purpose. She was not naive about what this meant. She was not proceeding from the assumption that love, if that was the direction this was going, which she was not yet prepared to conclude, was sufficient to rearrange the political and psychological structures of a reign. She had no interest in naive readings of what was between them, because naive readings were a form of self-deception that she had survived too much to indulge in. What she was interested in was the slower, harder thing. The possibility that two people who had both, in their very different ways, built elaborate systems for not being seen, could choose, deliberately and carefully, and with full understanding of the cost, to be seen by each other. She raised this with him, because she raised the things she was thinking with him now, because that had become the register between them in the past several weeks. They were in the council chamber late in the evening, which had become a pattern, a low-key shared workspace arrangement that neither of them had proposed formally, and that had developed by mutual, unspoken consent. He was reviewing the council's report on the charter implications, and she was reading the historical documentation of the previous primordial mate designation, and she said, without preamble, "The previous primordial companion, Lyris. Do you know why the histories don't say much about her?" He looked up. "I know the official version," he said. "The official version says she died in the 3rd year of the bond," Alara said. "The archive documents tell a slightly different story." He waited. "She didn't die," Alara said. "She was removed. The council of the time convinced the king that the bond was making him politically vulnerable, that his concern for her well-being was being used by enemies to influence his decisions, and that the strength of the bond was a liability. They found a legal instrument, not a charter provision, which doesn't exist, but a parallel administrative structure they'd built outside the charter, and they used it to reclassify her, to strip the primordial designation from the records and reclassify her as an administrative error. The silence that followed was very specific. "She was a person," Alara said quietly, "and they turned her into a clerical mistake." Kale was looking at the table. The expression on his face was the one she had learned to recognize as the expression of a man processing information that is landing somewhere deep rather than somewhere managed, and she gave him the space to process it, which she had learned was what was required. "The council member who proposed it," he said. "Ara Vos," she said. "Yes, an ancestor probably." She had discovered this, with the specific quality of irony that the archive had been producing for her regularly. The line died out 3 generations later. No Omega descendants survived to designation age. "The charter would prevent that now," he said, "with what we've established through the current review." "The charter would prevent the legal mechanism," she said. "It doesn't prevent the council from constructing parallel administrative structures. It doesn't prevent the argument from being made." She looked at Daddan, him steadily. "I'm telling you this because you should know it, not because I'm asking you for a guarantee. I don't think guarantees are the useful thing here." "What is the useful thing?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "Understanding what we're actually navigating," she said, "which is not just an ancient designation and its legal implications. It's a court that has organized itself around a version of you that this process is in the middle of revising, and that has multiple factions, with competing interests in what the revision produces, and some of those factions are going to try to use both of us to serve those interests." She paused. "And, separately from all of that, we are 2 people in a complicated situation, trying to figure out what is true between us, and what is the mark, and whether that distinction matters as much as it seems like it should." He looked at her for a long time, the gray eyes steady, and she looked back, and the quality of the looking between them had changed again, had moved into something that was less about assessment and more about recognition, the slow developing recognition that the archive documents described as the actual work of the primordial bond, not the mark's appearance on the platform, but this, the daily choosing to see and be seen. "I don't know," he said. And the honesty of it was extraordinary. Coming from him, the flatness of it, the absence of the usual political padding. I don't know what is the mark and what is me. I've been trying to determine that for 3 weeks, and I can't separate them. Neither can I, she said. I've been trying since the night of the auction. Does it matter? He said. And it was not rhetorical. It was genuine, the question of a man who was actually asking. She thought about it with the honesty she thought about everything. I think it matters less than I initially believed, she said. The mark recognized something. It didn't manufacture it. The founding texts say the primordial. Recognition requires a genuine correspondence to activate, which means whatever the mark found in me and whatever it found in you was already there. The mark just made it visible. The night outside the council chamber windows was the dark of deep autumn, and the candles on the table had burned down to their holders, and the archive documents were spread between them, and Cael Ashvale, Alpha King of Valdris, the most powerful person in the kingdom, looked at Ara Vos, who had been designation, number 1147, palace servant, and said very quietly, "You are the most honest person I have encountered in 6 years of this court. I'm the only person in this court," she said, with equal quiet, who had nothing to gain from performing. He was still for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, something that was not exactly a smile, but was in the territory of a smile, the territory of a man, discovering that he can be moved by something, and survive it. "That's not entirely true anymore," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." The political crisis that the constitutional scholars had predicted arrived in the 35th day, as these things tend to arrive, not as the dramatic confrontation that everyone had been bracing for, but as a procedural motion introduced quietly in the council by Lord Aldrin Mace, whose family had been positioned adjacent to Ashvale power for 4 generations, and who had the most to lose from a renegotiation of the court's power structures. The motion proposed a special review commission to assess the authenticity of the primordial mark designation in light of the 5-century absence of the phenomenon, on the grounds that the mark's appearance required independent verification before the charter provisions could be legally binding. It was a clever move, legally ambiguous enough to survive initial challenge, politically framed as procedural caution rather than direct opposition. The council received it with the divided attention of a body that had several different interests pulling in several different directions simultaneously. Cael heard the motion without visible reaction and requested 24 hours to consult with the designation office before responding. He came to Ilara that evening, not at midnight this time, but at the 7th bell, a reasonable hour, and he told her about the motion directly and without cushioning, because that had become the grammar between them. "How do you want to respond?" she said. "I want your perspective first," he said. She thought about it. "The motion is looking for a gap between the mark's legitimacy and the charter's requirements," she said. "It's assuming that if the mark can be questioned, the charter protections can be questioned, which means the strongest response is one that removes the gap." She paused. "The original charter doesn't require a commission to verify the mark. It requires the acknowledgment, which we've completed. Mace is introducing a requirement the charter doesn't contain. The response should say that clearly, without defensiveness, because defensiveness concedes that the question is legitimate." Cael looked at her with the expression that meant she had said the thing that was true in the exact number of words required. "The head of constitutional law told me something very similar," he said. "Then you don't need my agreement to proceed," she said. "I wanted your perspective," he repeated, and it was not a deflection. It was a statement of preference, of choosing to think through a significant decision in company rather than alone, which was a choice she understood to be significant for a man who had spent 6 years making every significant decision in the architectural isolation of absolute power. "Then my perspective is this," she said. "Mace's motion is political, and the appropriate response is legal and calm. But there's a longer-term question underneath it, which is whether the court is going to keep generating these challenges, and whether each one should be met individually, or whether there's a way to address the structure that keeps producing them." She met his eyes. "The structure is the classification system. As long as the system treats Omega designation as the bottom of a hierarchy, every time an Omega is near power, it will be treated as an anomaly requiring explanation. The Charter provides you legal authority to modify the designation system. The original designations were never intended to be permanent social categories. They were intended to be administrative descriptors. The quiet in the room after this was the quiet of something that had been said that could not be taken back, something that was not just about a council motion or a procedural challenge, but about the actual structural thing that had been in the background of everything since the auction platform, since her 9 years of invisible service, since the Kingdom of Valdris had organized its entire social architecture around the premise that some people's designation made their lives available to the powerful as tools. That is a significantly larger change than responding to a council motion, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He was looking at her with the gray eyes steady and full. Have you been planning that? He said, and there was no accusation in it, just the genuine question. I've been building toward it since the second day in the archive, she said honestly. It seemed like the kind of thing that required more than 3 weeks of foundation before it could be said. Something moved across his face that was complex and warm and undefended. You've been working on this for a month, he said. I had 9 years of reasons to work on it, she said simply. I just didn't have access until now. The thing that happened in his expression at this was the thing that had been developing over the course of 5 weeks of archive rooms and council chambers and midnight conversations and very careful honesty. And it was not simple, and it was not sudden, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. He answered the council motion the next morning with a legal response that was precisely what Alara had suggested. Calm and grounded in the Charter's original language, neither defensive nor aggressive. The response of someone who has read the document more carefully than the person challenging them, and is simply reporting what it says. Mace attempted a follow-up procedural question and received an equally calm response. And within an hour, it was apparent to everyone in the council chamber that the motion was going nowhere because the legal ground under it had been removed, and that the person most responsible for the quality of the legal response was the woman sitting at the king's right hand with a silver mark on her forearm, and the particular stillness of someone who has nothing to perform. That was the last formal challenge for some time. It was not the end of the court's adjustment to what was happening, which continued to be complicated and gradual and full of the small negotiations and recalibrations that any significant power shift requires. But the quality of the adjustment changed after the council chamber that morning, began to take on the texture of a reality being integrated rather than a disruption being managed, because the court of Stonehaven Palace was, at its core, a collection of people whose primary skill was reading the direction of power and moving in relation to it, and the direction of power was becoming increasingly clear. The modification of the designation office's administrative protocols was proposed formally by the king in the 42nd day, which was 12 days after the acknowledgment ceremony and 8 days after the council motion. And it was framed not as a social reform, but as a restoration of original charter intent, the return of the designation system to its founding, purpose as an administrative tool rather than a social hierarchy, the removal of the designations from the legal documents that had tied them to property rights, contractual restrictions, and the auction system. It was not the full scope of what needed to change, and both Alara and Kyle knew that, and said so to each other in the council chamber the night before the formal proposal. The honest accounting of what was possible now and what would take longer, the realistic navigation of a system that could be reformed incrementally more successfully than it could be dismantled completely. The auction system, specifically, was suspended pending review. This was not a quiet thing. The Grand Autumn Auction was 200 years old and had economic tentacles throughout the kingdom's social structure, and suspending it generated an immediate and significant response from the segments of the nobility whose wealth and power were most directly connected to it. Kale navigated this with the political intelligence that was genuinely extraordinary in him, the capacity for strategic patience that had built his reign, applied now to a different purpose. And Alara worked alongside him with the perspective of someone who understood what the auction system did to people, not as an abstraction, but as a lived experience. And together, they built a case that was both legally rigorous and humanly undeniable. Marin Vael, who had spent 22 years administering the designation system with the professional neutrality she had believed was the only appropriate response to the things she had witnessed, was given the Charter Review Commission instead, a formal body with real authority to recommend the modifications that the original administrative intent required. She accepted this with the same professional composure she brought to everything, and if her composure had a quality of relief in it that the professional mask did not entirely contain, Alara saw it and did not say anything about it directly, but did, in the next council meeting, publicly acknowledge Vael's institutional expertise and her willingness to engage with the Charter's original provisions, because acknowledgment costs nothing and means more than it appears to. Tessa was reassigned, at Alara's suggestion and with Kale's administrative approval, from general serving staff to the junior clerk's office, where her demonstrated capacity for careful attention and her literacy, which was not universal among the serving staff, and which she had learned on her own time with books borrowed from the palace library, were more appropriately utilized. This was a small thing in the scale of systemic change. Alara knew this. She made it anyway, because small things were also actual things, and because the change she was trying to build was not only the structural kind, but the human kind, the kind that is made one person at a time, the kind where someone whose capacity has been invisible suddenly finds that there is a room for it. And through all of this, quietly and without announcement, the thing between her and Kale continued to develop with the slow deliberateness that the founding documents had described and that she had decided to trust. It developed in the archive and the council chamber, and in the mornings when she found him already in the library when she arrived, and in the evenings when he came to the North Tower, not as a formal visit but simply because he was there, and in the gradual, unremarkable way that two people begin to understand each other when they stop managing the distance between them. The first time he reached for her hand without the context of a ceremony or a mark activation or a formal requirement. They were in the garden, one of the late autumn evenings when the last warmth of the season comes as a surprise, and they had been walking in a silence that was the comfortable kind, the silence of people who do not need to fill the space between them, and his hand found hers with the quality of something that did not need to announce itself, and she held it with the same quality, and they walked a little longer in the garden, and the silver mark was warm on her forearm, with a warmth that was not the initial burning of the platform, but something else, something that the founding documents, she thought, had tried to describe with the language of completion, which was a word she had been cautious about, but was beginning to understand. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. Some things do not require words immediately. They require, first, to be allowed to be what they are. If you're still here, I hope you felt that. I hope you felt the way that a hand reaching for another hand in a garden can be the end of something and the beginning of something simultaneously. Leave a comment and tell me what this story has meant to you, because I read every single one of them, and you are the reason I keep telling these stories. And your voice in the comments is part of what makes this something larger than just a narrator talking into the dark. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And now we are going to the place where we always end, which is the place where we find out what the world looks like after the change has settled in, and whether it is, in fact, worth the cost of getting there. Epilogue. 14 months after the Grand Autumn Auction, the second Grand Spring Convocation in the reformed calendar of Valdris was held in the same hall where the auction had always been held. The black marble, and the 1,000 candles, and the 40-foot painted ceiling, all the architecture of exposure, repurposed for something different, because it turned out that rooms built for visibility could be used for other kinds of seeing, that the chandelier and the circular platform and the tiered seating were just a hall after all, and halls were available to whatever their inhabitants decided to do with them. The convocation was not an auction. It was an assembly of designation review boards from across Valdris, representatives from all the major territories and the capital, gathering to report on the first year of the charter restoration's implementation, and to address the practical challenges that the administrative modifications had generated, because change at systemic scale generated practical challenges in quantities proportional to the scale, and the kingdom was deep in the productive difficulty of that process. It was noisy and complicated, and sometimes contentious, and it was exactly what Alara had said it would be when she had described it to Cale in the council chamber. The gradual, hard-won quality of actual reform rather than the clean narrative arc that symbolic reform preferred. She sat at the head of the council table, which was now placed on the platform that had once been the auction stage, and she was not in the white silk of the Lot 7 presentation, and she was not in the dark wool of the cautious early weeks, and she was not in the elaborate formal wear of the court ceremonies. She was in deep blue, the color the founding documents associated with the primordial companion, and the silver mark was visible on her forearm, with a clarity and permanence that had not diminished in 14 months, and she was running the meeting with the calm, specific attention of someone who had been running meetings for about 8 months and had discovered that the organizational skills developed in 9 years of invisible service transferred to visible authority with a reliability that she found both practical and quietly satisfying. Kyle was present as the king, which he remained, because the charter's primordial designation was not a dissolution of the governance structure, but a modification of its character, and he had not relinquished any of the legal authority of the crown, but had, over the course of 14 months, developed a relationship with that authority that looked substantially different from what the court had observed in the first 6 years of his reign. He was still the most powerful person in the room. He was just no longer the only person in the room who was allowed to be worth anything. Marin Vale presented the Designation Review Commission's first-year report with the precision of someone who had found, late in a long career, a version of her work that she could believe in, and the data she presented was the kind of data that is simultaneously incomplete and significant, showing early indicators of the changes that take the longest to measure, because they are changes in the way people understand themselves and what is available to them, the kinds of changes that start as administrative modifications, and eventually, if they are maintained and built upon, become so ordinary that the next generation cannot fully understand what the previous generation was managing without them. Tessa, who was now a junior designation clerk in the capital office, and had developed in the past year an almost alarming capacity for administrative detail and an interest in the charter's historical provisions, that Oswin the librarian had told Alara was the most enthusiastic engagement with the archive materials he had witnessed in 30 years, presented a case summary that made several of the senior designation officials shift in their seats, because it contained a recommendation that no one on the commission had been prepared to make yet, and that she had simply arrived at by reading the documents and following the logic where it led, and Alara watched this happen with the specific quality of satisfaction that comes from watching someone who was previously invisible demonstrate the full scope of what they are. After the meeting, in the garden that had become the place they went at the end of days that required the open air, Cale stood beside her in the late spring light and said, "Tessa is going to end up running the designation office." "Yes," Alara said. "Probably within 5 years. You knew this when you recommended her reassignment." "I suspected it," she said honestly. "I thought she deserved the chance to find out." He was quiet for a moment, and the garden was full of the returning life of spring, and the silver mark on her arm was warm with the warmth that was not burning, but presence, the warmth of something settled and real. "I have been thinking," he said. "Yes," she said, inviting continuation. "About what the founding documents say about the full expression of the primordial bond," he said, and his voice had the careful quality of someone navigating territory they have approached and retreated from several times, and are choosing today not to retreat. About what complete means in that context. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the garden was doing its spring thing around them with complete indifference to the significance of the moment, which was appropriate, because the most significant moments rarely arrange themselves with ceremony. They arrive in gardens in ordinary light, when two people have spent enough time becoming legible to each other, that the last remaining distance feels less like protection and more like habit. "I know what it means in that context," she said. "Do you know what you want it to mean in this one?" he said. And it was the most unguarded question he had asked her, more unguarded than the archive discussions and the council chamber honesty and the hand in the garden, because it was the question that sat at the center of everything, and that they had been approaching from all directions for 14 months. She thought about it with the honesty. She thought about everything. The real honesty. Not the managed honesty of someone navigating a difficult situation, but the honesty of someone who had decided, a long time ago in a North Tower room with a silver mark burning on her arm, that she was not going to spend her life being partially present to the things that mattered. "Yes," she said, "I do." He was looking at her with the gray winter eyes that had become, over 14 months of archive rooms and council chambers and garden walks, and slow, daily, deliberate choosing, the eyes she knew best in the world, and she was looking at him with the dark eyes that had looked at him on the auction platform without flinching and had never stopped looking, and he reached for her hand the way he had in the autumn garden, with the quality of something that does not need to announce itself, and she held it, and the spring light came through the palace garden trees in long green-gold lines, and the kingdom of Valdris was in the middle of becoming something different from what it had been, slowly and with difficulty and without guarantee, which is the only honest way anything important ever becomes anything. The silver mark on Ara Vos's arm pulsed once, warmly, and settled. And in the palace library, Oswin, the librarian was carefully rewriting the catalog entry for the founding charter documents, because the section that had previously read historical curiosity, primordial mate designation, last recorded instance 5 centuries prior needed updating. Because the last recorded instance was not, anymore, 5 centuries ago. It was 14 months ago, in an auction hall, when a king had walked down from his throne to look at a woman who was not afraid of him, and had touched her wrist, and had started, without knowing it, the slow work of becoming who he was supposed to be. That is where this story ends. Or rather, that is where this telling of it ends. Because the story itself continues in the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of 2 people who chose each other, and chose the work, and chose to be seen, which is a story that does not conclude so much as it continues. Season after season, choice after choice, the archive documents and the council chambers and the gardens, in all their weathers, the slow accumulating weight of a life built towards something true. If you are still here, I am grateful to you, more than the format of this space allows me to properly express. You have been present for this story, which means you have been present for Alara standing on that platform and deciding not to flinch, for Kale walking down from a throne he had been using as a wall, for the mark that recognized something both of them had been carrying for longer than either of them knew. Leave this story a comment. Tell me what it gave you. Share it with someone who is standing in their own corridor, waiting for the world to notice them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are more. There are always more. And they are waiting for you. And remember, wherever you are tonight, that the quietest people in the room are very often the ones with the most extraordinary things to say. They are just waiting for someone worth saying them to.